I'm a Cherokee County Master Gardener and have been for quite a long time. I have done this seminar multiple times, but it's generally been in person. And this is a little different for me not having an audience, but I think it might actually benefit you to have something to go back to refer to and use this as a reference. If you don't catch everything I say the first time, you can go back and see what I had to say and maybe learn something each time you go through it. We are going to cover several things as we're going through this PowerPoint. First will be selecting your location. That is important so you know what kind of plants you're going to need and also sizes of containers and so forth. We're going to talk about container choices. The world is your oyster. There's a lot of things you can use for containers. We are going to talk about soil mix. Again, you never want to be penny wise and pound foolish when it comes to soil in your containers. And also we're going to talk about preparing your container before you plant it. Then of course, plant choices, which is the fun part of doing a container: color, size, texture, what their requirements are as far as are they shade loving, sun loving, do they require a lot of moisture or not. We're going to talk about other options as far as can you use annuals and perennials, can you use them together? We even talk about using houseplants or small trees or conifers in your containers. And then there's the element of design, putting it all together. I'm sure you've probably heard the terms spiller, filler, and thriller. And we'll talk more about that later on. And then once your container is complete and it's been out there on your porch for a while, there will probably be some maintenance that you need to be aware of. And so we're going to cover that as well. And I hope by the end of this PowerPoint, you will be ready to get creative and make your own container. First, let's talk about containers. Containers really fill a great purpose because sometimes we're in a small space. If you're in an apartment, you don't have a garden that you can plant, but you want to have something colorful on your back porch or your deck. They are used for framing entrances. If you have a garden that is kind of low and you want to add some height and interest, using a container in the middle of your garden can add that for you. Obviously your deck and where you entertain, just having some color out there, and it can really be an accent anywhere. And for those of you that just don't want to dig in the hard red clay earth that we have here in Georgia, containers are an easy way to get what you want and then not have to do that and just get your bag soil and use that instead. So wherever you're going to select your location, you want to do a little research first. You want to know how much sunlight does that area get? If it gets morning sun and afternoon shade, does it get the heat of the day from 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock? Is it just get high shade and no sunlight? Those are the kind of things you're going to need to know before you go plant shopping. So a little research before you start your plant shopping is always a good thing. So containers, and this is where you really can get creative. I like to go to Goodwill, garage sales, thrift stores. I've seen containers, obviously the usual, the ceramic containers, the wood containers, plastic. But lately I saw a Tonka truck that somebody actually, a toy that they put a sedum garden in the back of. So you can really get creative with what you use for containers, but just the things to be aware of. The thin plastic containers deteriorate over time, especially if they're in the sun, but they're fine for a season, not a problem, and they're also lighter weight. Lighter colors absorb less heat. So if you are going to have a sun container, maybe a lighter color is better for that. Clay pots, they look great in your Tuscan garden, but they're very porous and they dry out quickly. So they're great for sedums. If you really want to have that Tuscan look, perhaps you use the clay pot and then set another pot inside of it just to kind of keep the moisture in your container. Wood pots are great, but cedar wood is probably the best. Obviously, if you have other wood, that's fine. It just won't be something you'll have forever. It'll eventually rot, but cedar's good. And if it's a finished wood where they've put some sort of chemicals on it, it's probably fine for ornamentals, but I would not use it for vegetables. Another thing to be aware of are small pots do restrict growth and they dry out quickly. I tend to go towards, at least a 13-inch wide top of the pot size. And then you have, it's small enough pot, but if you get a large pot, we're going to talk about some things you can do to kind of fill that up rather than filling it completely with soil. But what you want to put in your pot is going to really dictate what size container you're going to need. So if you're really ready to make this fantastic container, you're going to have lots of plants in it, obviously you'll need a bigger container. So we talked about the containers, but now we've got to prep the container. And most importantly is it must have drainage. And depending on the size of the base, you want to at least have, if it's a smaller base, at least 3 half-inch holes or 1 large, maybe 3/4 to 1 inch across hole in the center. If it isn't a pot that you can drill holes into, perhaps this, my example of the Tonka truck, it may already have drainage in it. If you watered that, it would probably go down the sides and down the bottom and it wouldn't be a problem. It's just the water has to escape some way so that you're not creating some sort of bog or swamp that you're going to have root rot. So very important to have drainage. What I like to do if I'm putting this particular container on a porch or a deck is to line the bottom with a paper towel or a coffee filter. It doesn't block the water going through, but it does block the soil from coming out and dirtying up your porch floor or your deck floor. And it keeps the soil in the pot versus it going out. Now, if you've picked a giant container, my advice to you is to fill it with something like water bottles or crushed nursery pots. These are things that are lightweight and they'll promote drainage. Now I've heard people say, oh, put rocks in the bottom or put pot shards in the bottom, but that just adds weight to it. And my husband gives me a hard time because one of my favorite containers are these ceramic pots. And I don't buy small ones, I buy large ones. And if they need to be moved, they're very heavy. And they're even heavier once you put soil in them and once you water them. So what I like to do is I get my water bottles, I fill it up to about the line where the bottom of the plant size pot I'm getting. And then generally annuals take 8 or 10 inches for root space. So I fill it up with, up to that point, and then I'll fill it in with soil. Now, obviously the soil is going to go down in between the pot, in between the bottles, but it will give it plenty of drainage and it'll make the pot lighter. Soil is very important, and you want to buy a soil that is specifically formulated for containers. No going out and shoveling out of your garden, your Georgia soil. You'll end up with some very compacted soil, and it'll probably be a sure kill for your plants. So the soil that you get that's specific for containers, it's a mix of peat moss and perlite. Sometimes you'll see some bark in it, but they've created it so that it's well draining and that it does not compact and promote root rot. A lot of them, like I know the Miracle Grows of the world, have slow release fertilizer in them, which is fine. If it doesn't, then you just get your Osmocote or your other slow release fertilizer and you can add that to your pot as you're planting. Now the fun part, plant choices. There's so many out there, and going to a nursery is like going to a candy store for me. But I've already done my research. I know what where I'm going to put this container and say if it's going to be sun or shade. I know it's hard to focus when you're in a nursery, but you want to look for plants that are going to fit your requirements. So if it's a sun container, check out those little tags that are in the pots that specify, is this sun, part sun, or shade? It also gives you moisture requirements. Are you going to be out there watering your container at least once a day in the summertime or not? That is going to play into what kind of plants you're going to want to select. You also want to pay attention to how big are those plants going to be at maturity. Obviously, when you're at the nursery in early spring, those plants are not at their mature height and size. So you want to make sure that you read that and that the plant that you're putting in your container is going to be in scale to your container. So if you're having a small container and you've got a 6-foot plant, that isn't really going to look to scale, and that's important. The types of plants, we mentioned annuals. Annuals are plants that complete their life cycle in one season. For instance, marigolds or zinnias, you know, and then when the freeze comes, they're gone. Perennials are ones that come back year after year, and I like to use them in containers. It also helps to save money because I can get a little crazy when I start doing containers in the springtime, but the perennials will come back and I can actually just put in a pocket of color. For instance, in this example here, there's a fern, a hosta, and an impatient. And so that hosta and the fern came back and I just had to put in a pocket of color, which was the impatient. And don't forget shrubs. Shrubs are also, if you have a small shrub or a small conifer to put in a container, perhaps, you know, framing your garage door, then that stays in the pot. But then every season you can switch out. So in the wintertime, perhaps you plant pansies around it. In the summertime, perhaps you're planting marigolds or zinnias or something like that. But it's that constant in there, the evergreen, and then you just switch out depending on the season. Houseplants are also a great plant to use in containers. More likely in a shade container because they're tropicals and they're in that, you know, rainforest. They're used to being shaded. So I like to use houseplants in my containers that I plant in the shade. Texture is also as impactful as color. There's periods where blooms fade. And so if you have some interesting texture, it keeps your container looking interesting. And for instance, in this container, you've got the long strappy leaves, and then you've got the delicate fronds of the fern, and then you have the impatient that, you know, the smaller leaves, but that color. But if the impatient should take a little rest and isn't blooming, you still have some interest in there. And of course, color is one of the reasons people love containers because it's constant color when you put annuals and something like that in there. Colors that blend are the complementary colors. We're going to kind of talk a little bit about that later on. We're going to talk about that color wheel. Probably you remember that from grade school. And then contrasting colors make a statement. Your blues, your pinks, your purples are cooler colors that kind of give you that serene feeling. And then you've got your warm colors like red and orange and yellows. And those are that tropical, you know, stand out, vibrant, you know, makes you feel like you're sitting on the beach in Jamaica. Those make a real statement. Put those by your swimming pool. Like I mentioned, you've probably heard the terms thriller, filler, and spiller, and I'd love to know who created that because they're a genius. This is something to keep in the back of your mind as you're going plant shopping. Probably the first thing you're going to be looking for is the thriller. Now that plant could be dramatic in color or size or unique. In the case where I said putting an evergreen, that would be your thriller. It's probably, you know, the tallest thing in your pot that you're going to keep as the focal point. But there's lots of dramatic plants out there that you may want to use as your thriller. We're going to talk about a few of them in here in just a minute. Then there's the filler. That kind of fills in the empty spaces around the thriller. And then your spiller plants are the ones that kind of fall over the sides. They're the trailing plants, and they make the container look full and abundant. So it really kind of gives you that full look. Some examples of thrillers are the grasses. They look pretty throughout the season, and then when they actually put their seed heads on, they really look interesting, like this purple fountain grass. And then you surround that with some filler plants. The Persian shield, it's unique in its color. It's a deep purple with the green veined leaves, and it gets about 2 feet tall, unless it's really happy to get a little bit taller than that. Other things like elephant ears, caladiums, cannas. A canna would be a perennial, and that would come back every year. And even when it's not in bloom, it's got that interesting foliage. Some of them have variegated foliage, which looks good even when it's not in bloom. A lot of you know the spikes, they call it, or they're actually Dracaena. Dracaena is actually a house plant, but a lot of people use that as a thriller plant in the center of their containers because it adds height to the container. And spillers, a lot of the spillers we know, like the potato vine, is great in sun containers, and they've got that in that chartreuse color and then the dark black color. It looks beautiful going out, falling out of sun containers. And you can actually overwinter that tuber. If at the end of the season you're taking your container apart to plant your winter container, you can save those tubers and plant them next year. Ivy is another one. The Wandering Jew, again, a house plant, but looks great in a shade container flowing out of the container. Million Bells, one of my favorites, or Calibrachoa as its name is, or the familiar name is Million Bells, but it is actually a perennial. Mine come back every year in my containers, and they're actually one of the first things that start to bloom when spring comes. Fillers. Dusty Miller is a great filler. It can be used in the sun or shade. It's got that silvery color and it kind of sets off everything else in the container. Coleus is another one. That euphorbia there in the picture, the little white tiny flowers. It's a very airy plant and it can look great in containers. It just fills in the spaces, kind of feels like you're floating on air. They just kind of, the little white flowers. All of you probably are familiar with the little wax begonias. Angelonia, one of my favorites. It's not something that has to be deadheaded. Pentas, draw in all your butterflies, and Impatiens, great for some shade containers. So lots of choices for fillers. And when we start talking about getting your container ready, you need to be thinking, okay, is this going to go up against a wall, or is this going to be something that people are going to walk around? That will kind of help you determine, am I going to place that thriller in the center of the pot, or am I going to place it towards the back? Because if it is against a wall, you want to put the taller plants towards the back. And even if that plant isn't at its full size yet, but you've read that tag and you know it's going to get tall, you'll want to put that towards the back, not towards the front, obviously. Planting and grouping. So in the fillers, it's nice to have multiples. And so it looks a little more cohesive. And just to add interest, kind of varying the heights in the pot will give you that interest that you want. All right, so we talked a little bit about, I mentioned color and that color wheel. We talk about complementary colors, and as you're choosing your flowers, and a lot of you probably just know, just because looking at something it appeals to your eye or does not appeal to your eye. But there's several different color schemes. Complementary colors, those would be those across each other on the color wheel. So for instance, purple and yellow, they look good together, those because they're complementary. You can do a monochromatic color scheme in your container. That would be one color, but it could be different shades of that particular color, say pinks. Analogous colors are those next to each other on the color wheel, like red and purple. Those would look nice together, and that would obviously be a real statement with the red and purple. And like I mentioned before, the hot colors, the reds, the oranges, the yellows, and the cooler colors, which are your blues and your pinks and purples. Here's that color wheel I was talking about. So for instance, we talked about the yellow and purple. They're across from each other. They're complementary. The red and green would be complementary. Now, green in the plant world is a neutral. So obviously every plant is mostly has some green on it. So obviously that goes with everything. Blue and orange would be another complementary. And as we said before, using the reds and purples because they're next to each other. And all those hot colors, the yellow, orange, and reds, they would look good together as well. So here's a couple examples of those different color schemes. Monochromatic, again, like I said, this is just shades of pinks together. We've got the Million Bells flowing out of the pot. There's some wax begonias that have pink blooms. And then the coleus in the back has some pink in its leaves. And so it draws it all together as a cohesive. Here's an analogous. Here's that red with the purple. That's the red Calibrachoa Million Bells. There's a coleus there that's got the red and purple in it together. The Angelonia, your purple there. And in the back, I think there's some silver. I think that's a lamb's ear that's in the far back of that particular pot. Here's some complementary colors. This is the red and green. Here's a red Rex Begonia along with a chartreuse green euchera, and then the green and red plant, the fuchsia, the variegated fuchsia, is in the back. And like I mentioned before, neutrals, white, black, and your basic green are all would go with anything that you select. Obviously, the silver and white would kind of lighten up a darker container. If you have some of the real bright colors, maybe some dark foliage, like in the black, would look good to kind of set off the others. Here's a silver and white container. We have the white Calibrachoa, the white Angelonia in the back, the silver Dichondra that's trailing out of the front of it. White and silver look nice together, and kind of, especially in the night garden, it kind of gives, kind of glows in the dark. And as I mentioned before, texture is very important in your containers, just to add interest. For example, the one on the left, you've got your fern with the delicate fronds, and you have your begonia that has the wide leaves, or the euchre with the wider leaves. It just kind of gives it some different textures, make it more interesting. The photograph on the right, you have a sago palm, which has very interesting texture, and then the little flapjack sedums with the spilling creeping jenny coming out. So you have the narrow strappy leaves with the wide sedum leaves, and then the very tiny leaves coming out. It kind of looks like a water fountain. And like I said, you need to remember plants grow. So you need to allow room when you're planting, as much as you want it to have instant gratification, which is the world we live in today. You do need to leave some room for the plants to grow. So I've showed here two photographs. One was taken on May 20th, and then this same pot was taken on June 10th. So you can see how much those plants have grown. You couldn't see the soil on June 10th, but on May 20th, we did allow some room for those plants to grow. So you just need to keep that in mind. So we've built our container, and now we've placed it out there. And you need to remember a few tips about maintaining that. You will want to make sure you water. Because of the hot summers that we have here in Georgia, unless it is a shade container, which may not need daily watering, most sun containers will require frequent watering. Because it's not in the ground, you don't have that groundwater moisture to keep those roots hydrated. So you want to make sure you water. You want to make sure that you're maintaining what the plant needs. So if it is a sedum, obviously it doesn't need that much water. But if it's something like the annuals that we're used to seeing, they do need more water, and you will want to water those probably daily. Sometimes on the real hot days, it could be twice a day. And fertilizer, we've put in that slow release fertilizer early on, or it was in the soil that we put in already. But if it does eventually wash out because of the frequent waterings. That fertilizer will wash out very quickly. And so you want to just keep an eye out for chlorosis of the leaves, which just means the leaves are starting to yellow. It probably indicates that fertilizer is necessary. I like to do about a plan of about every 2 or 3 weeks. I will put in a liquid feed, Miracle Grow liquid feed on the containers to keep them looking good. And last of all, I want you to be creative. No, you can't put a dog in your container. Well, I guess you could, but that's not the point here. But I want you to go out and be creative, because it is a fun thing to do. I am not an artist by any stretch of the imagination, but I do enjoy making containers. It is my creative outlet, and I hope it will be for you too. Here's some references that we took to create this PowerPoint, if you're interested in looking up those. And I want to thank each of you for joining us today and for tuning into our programming. We really appreciate it.
All right, so we're going to transition real quick here to a recording of Mariana actually.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you stuck around after our PowerPoint. We're going to actually do a demo outside on containers.
Let's see here. Sorry, guys.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you stuck around after our PowerPoint. We're going to actually do a demo outside on containers, and kind of a little bit of a repeat of what you've already heard, but maybe seeing it in person might be helpful. You may hear some nature sounds, birds, roosters, but that's all part of being outside. So let's get started. I have a nice array of plants here. They're not all going in this pot, but kind of just to show you what we talked about, thrillers, fillers, and spillers. Today I'm going to make a shade pot. I only have one thriller to show you, and this is a holly fern, and it is evergreen, and it's something that's going to stay in my pot, and I'm going to plant around it. So this is our thriller. We have some fillers such as begonias, coleus. Here's another begonia. A little hosta. Remember I talked about perennials and annuals, using them together, and then you save money and time, and it'll come back next year. For spillers, we have this little Terenia or wishbone flower. We have a creeping fig. We have some wire vine. Here's a house plant, the spiderwort, or not spiderwort, but Tradescantia or wandering Jew. And the little impatient, again, another filler. But I've kind of set over aside here what I'm thinking of using today. I'm going to do the fern, a begonia, and a wax begonia. We talked about the silver kind of being a neutral, and with these darker colors, it will kind of set it off. So we have some Dusty Miller, and we have this Dichondra Silver Falls, which can take some shade, but it's definitely will need some sun. So this container is probably going to get some morning sun. So first off, here's my container, probably about 13 inches across, not real deep. I know I talked about using water bottles or crushed nursery pots, but this pot isn't big enough for something like that. So we're just going to plant directly in this. I have my little paper towel that I'm going to use to cover up the holes here at the bottom. We've got 5 holes, they're about 1/2 inch each, so it's going to provide plenty of drainage. And this is going to cover those holes. We have our potting mix. Again, we're not doing a Miracle Grow commercial, but it's what we have. It is specific for containers, and it also feeds up to 6 months, so it already contains the fertilizer. So I'm going to put that in my pot here. I may just end up pouring it. It's probably going to be easier. I'm going to put it up to about the height of these pots, and then I'm going to plant into it. And as you can see, this is a very light mix. It has the perlite, it has little bark in it, peat, and so it's a well-draining soil, perfect for containers. And you can see I just have it up to about 4 inches to the top, so we can plant in it easily. So what I like to do is kind of set it in the pot just to kind of get, now I've kind of set them out in an array here just to kind of get a feel for it, but just to see what it looks like. So again, this is going to be in the back of my container. It's going to be up against a wall. And then I've got my fillers here, the begonia. This one's called Jurassic Watermelon. I just think it's so vibrant. And I have a cute little doublet begonia. He's going to be another filler. He's going to go here, maybe. And now I've got some Dusty Miller, so I'm thinking, maybe I'll switch this up. Maybe the begonia will go here and the Dusty Miller might go here. And then that same silver will be set off if we put that kind of in the front. So that's kind of the direction I think we're going to be going. It kind of just gives me an idea of where we're going to go from here. So take it all out again. And you take it out of your pots. Now this fern I just brought from home this morning, so it has not grown in this container very long. But if you open up your, or not open up, but take your pot out, take your plant out of your pot, you see a bunch of roots swirling around the bottom. You want to make sure you loosen that up so that they go down into the soil rather than choking themselves. Oh, we lost a frond there. Kind of set this in just so that the top of the soil line of the plant is about 1 inch or so below the rim of the pot. Dig down here a little bit more. There we go. And we're going to cover up his feet with some of these fillers so he won't look so ugly. So then we got our Rex Begonia. And again, with the Rex Begonias, they're houseplants. If you want to use it in your house this winter, you can take it out of your pot before your first freeze and have it decorate your house. There's the Rex. I'm doing this, I can't really see what I'm doing. And then we have our little Begonia, which will get bigger. And these are not root bound, so I'm just kind of sticking them in. And he has pretty little flowers. And our Dusty Miller. The Dusty Miller can take shade or sun. Again, a great neutral with the silver and kind of lightens up this container because we have a lot of dark foliage. And then we're going to use for our spiller, this little Silver Falls Dichondra. See, he's a little root bound. So we're going to loosen up his roots a little bit. And go in the front. Now he can really spill there. Need a little bit more soil under him. Okay. So there we have the spillers, fillers, and thrillers. Make sure there's some room between them. They're going to grow. They're going to get bigger. I know it isn't like super full right now, but it will grow. And so you just got to be aware of that when you're planting. Plants do grow. And then what I'll do is I'll just fill in. What I like to do is kind of shake it, and it kind of fills in the gaps, takes out the air. Now, once I have this made, now if this was going to be out in the sun, I might add a layer of like Nature's Helper or some light, fine bark mulch, kind of would keep the moisture in. And we do another. Let me see what I'm doing here. Another shake. This guy needs to come out a little bit. There we go. You're supposed to be more in the middle. That's what happens when you do things backwards. All right, well, that's pretty good for backwards, but anyway, you get the idea. We've got our thriller, fillers, and our spillers. Now, you're going to water this in. Again, you're welcome to add some mulch to it if you wanted to. And then if it did not have any fertilizer in it, I would sprinkle some Osmocote or slow release fertilizer on it, which would keep it going for about 3 to 6 months. And then go back during the summer months, because you're going to be watering it more frequently, and probably do a liquid feed every 2 to 3 weeks just to keep it looking good. Now, if I don't have many flowers here that require deadheading, but another thing you can do as kind of maintaining your begonias is to deadhead. Now, these little Terenias would do better if you take off the spent flowers, which is what deadheading is, taking off the spent flowers, and then they'll produce more blooms. This one is a pretty good one. Begonias are kind of self-cleaning. And that's really the only blooming plant in here. We're doing a lot of foliage in this particular one. The only real bloomer is going to be this little tiny begonia, and it will kind of take care of himself. So here you go. There's your container.
All right. Well, as good as we can do virtually, that live demonstration I thought really helped complement the PowerPoint. So Mariana is here live with us. So if Mariana, I don't know if you followed the chat reel, if some of these questions, if you want to take over and talk about maybe like the herbs, and I saw some vegetable questions.
Sure. I think the first question that was in the chat, and I think I told that person, I feel your pain regarding chipmunks. I have lots of them myself, and they're the bane of my existence. I have a couple things I've tried. I have some pine trees, and I find the non-composted pine cones, the ones that are the most prickly, and I actually put those in my pots around the plants, and that usually keeps them at bay. Of course, they'll find the one little spot that I didn't put a pine cone. I have heard of cayenne pepper, sprinkling the dirt or soil with cayenne pepper, which works initially, but then you get a rain and it kind of washes it away. I've heard of people putting like the clear plastic fork silverware sticking up, kind of similar to the pine cone situation where it's, a little prickly and difficult to get to. Josh, do you have any other suggestions for chipmunk control?
I've heard of sweet gumballs. If you have old sweet gumballs similar to pine cones. Yeah.
Pine cones, yeah. Yeah, that has probably been, pine cones is usually my go-to on those. And I do have lots of chipmunks. So I think we had some questions about growing vegetables in containers, and at our house, I don't have a lot of sun, and where I do have sun is not necessarily where I have soil. So I actually plant my tomatoes in the turnaround of my driveway, which gets nice sun. We use whiskey barrels, and they work great. I don't use the container soil for those, though. I actually use the soil, and I don't know what they call it, planting mix, because it's a little bit heavier, and I use that versus using like a container soil with lots of perlite and things in it. But we've grown peppers and tomatoes in containers. Those are the two. I'm not a huge vegetable gardener. My husband, we have to get our heirloom tomatoes every year, so we definitely plant those. But I was unfamiliar with the terminology of three sisters, which says a corn, a bean, and a squash. I've never grown corn in a container. I'm not sure what kind of bean they're referring to. A squash, you could probably grow a squash in a container. I have not tried that.
I would think with any of your vegetables, it's important to know the variety. Like the tomatoes, you're probably going to do better with the determinant instead of the much more kind of unruly indeterminates. And maybe with beans, dwarf beans instead of full runners and things like that.
Sure.
Now, Mariana, you mentioned like the fertilization and slow release fertilizer. If you're using a sort of, I guess, unfortified potting mix, would you want a liquid feed from the very beginning with that slow release kind of being a little bit more slow to actually start fertilizing those plants?
Yeah, I usually do a diluted fertilizing, my first one, and then, ongoing 2 weeks, every 2 weeks. But in between those times, because the fertilizer does wash out because you are watering frequently, that's where that liquid feed comes in. And in between, you've got the slow release.
Gosh, I know I had one more.
Someone was asking about growing evergreens in your container and planting it in the fall as my recommendation. Preparing the soil. If you're planting in the hard red clay, you're going to want to amend that soil with some compost. And you want to make sure that the hole is at least twice as big or 1.5 times as big as the tree or the shrub that you're planting. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Josh.
I mean, that sounds about right. Where you are growing those permanent or perennials, do you kind of have to repot them every few years just to make more room for roots and soil, or pot them up and do a bigger pot eventually?
You're talking about flowers versus like shrubs and trees.
Yeah, well, even your
Yeah.
shrubs, like if you
Yeah.
got,
Well, the shrubs definitely are gonna probably grow bigger and have lots of root system and eventually will need to be added, which I think is what this individual is asking about putting that in your yard. As far as, yeah, perennials, after usually a few years, you're gonna have to divide those to create some more room. And when I use perennials, I also like to use some annuals too, because perennials have their season. Unless there's some texture that you really enjoy, but actually throwing in a couple of annuals for consistent color is always a good thing to do.
and Helen just asked, what is content of nutrients for use for fertilizer, nitrogen, potassium, calcium? I think usually those osmocotes are sort of balanced for flowering plants, right?
Yeah, there's different ones. They have for specific, they have for vegetables, and they have one that's for blooming plants. I usually just get the 15, 30, 15, or yeah, I think that's right, of the osmocote. I don't worry too much about it.
Have you used many herbs in your containers?
Well, like I said, I don't have a lot of sun, which herbs require a lot of sun, but I have seen them used in sun containers. Like the fennel is a great textured plant. Also, things that the butterflies enjoy. Parsley, another great, that a lot of the herbs look great in the winter containers because they kind of stay evergreen, like sages and things like that. So you just want to make sure it's not in a container that's, you have other plants in it that are going to require a lot of moisture. Herbs like to be on the drier side. So you want to make sure that you're not combining it with plant that is going to need more moisture.
And then are there sort of plant options for maybe that more cool season, container season, you know, after things start cooling down or early in the spring that maybe aren't as common through the midsummer garden or the
So you're saying like a fall winter container?
fall, winter,
Yeah.
or fall, spring?
I like to use, well, obviously pansies are a go-to for color, but a lot of the evergreen ferns, eucharas. There's some grasses that can look really, good in a container that, unlike the purple fountain grass, which after the first freeze is going to turn brown, but there's some other grasses that do well throughout the winter. Some carex look good. Let's see, what else do I use in my containers? Snapdragons. They may not do a lot during the winter months, but they'll be the first things that'll bloom for you in the springtime.
And what are your biggest pests if you have disease or insect issues? Do you see that often in your container gardens?
Not so much in my outdoor containers. Pests tend to go towards plants that are suffering. If a plant is not getting watered and it's susceptible more to pests, but if you keep things watered and fertilized, you probably will have less pest issues. I have some, it's like the neem oil or something like that. If I did see like spider mites or mealybugs or something like that, that I could spray on the foliage. Yeah.
Well, any more questions from the group?
I want to know, where do you get Nature's Helper in the Marietta area?
Well, I don't know the Marietta area. Sometimes it's not called Nature's Helper. I think they call it composted pine bark or something like that. I mean, I've seen it at the Home Depots. It's not necessarily labeled Nature's Helper. Isn't that correct, Josh?
Is it just like the soil conditioner?
Yeah,
You
soil
mentioned that
conditioner,
is
that's
more
the
just
one.
like a mulch on top.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's labeled soil conditioner.
Mhm.
That's what it says. And
Mhm.
it, which is basically just the composted
Yeah.
pine bark. Fine.
Yeah.
Does
and
that help you?
It's usually $3-4 for I think what 2 cubic foot bag. It's pretty
Mhm.
affordable.
Thank you.
Special considerations for fabric grow bags, pots versus regular plastic or clay pots.
I have never grown in a fabric grow bag, so I don't know that I can answer that question. Have you, Josh?
Uh, I haven't. I would think the biggest thing there would probably be they would dry out maybe even faster. Would be
Right.
what I would think. Yeah. But I know Veronica, one of our master gardeners, has grown in them and really likes them.
Mhm.
What about your soils? How often do you change soils? Do you reuse the soils from last year?
Well, I usually take out on my annual containers, take out the top 8 or 10 inches and put it in the compost. The stuff that's gone down amongst the bottles or the very bottom, I don't worry about those so much, but if I do leave, if it's a tall container, I'm leaving some soil at the bottom, I do kind of rake it up or trowel it so that I create that drainage again. And then usually like every other year, I'll just replace all the soil. So that's how I do it.
Well, and I guess if they're going to go maybe even with some more exotic stuff like succulents or cactuses, I know there's
Mhm.
special soil blends for all of these things and sometimes even citrus. Is that as important as just having a regular potting mix that does have perlite or?
If you are growing succulents, I would definitely advise on getting more of the cactus and succulent soil, which has a lot of sand and, kind of more rocky, just because that really needs good drainage. You definitely don't want those to sit in water. But for most of my pots, I'm just using the regular container mix that you buy, the Miracle Grows or the Pikes or the different ones that are specifically for containers.
Well, everyone, thank you for joining us. I'll get this recording up hopefully later on this afternoon, and I'll also email out a quick survey, what you thought, suggestions on future presentations. So if you wouldn't mind taking a minute or two to give us some feedback, we would appreciate it. And thanks for joining us, and hope you tune in next month. We'll have Karen Garland, one of our master gardeners, talk on pollinator gardening. June is, of course, National Pollinator Month. So hope to see you again next month. And have a great weekend. Mariana, thank you so much for all of your time and wisdom on the subject. I think we all learned something, and hope we maybe spend some time in the nurseries and putting together some containers this weekend. So
Yeah, get creative, everybody. Have fun. Thank you.